In the blistering summer of 1887, Redstone, Texas, wasn't just a town, it was a crucible. Forged in heat and hardship, dust hung thick in the air, coating every porch, every face, like the West itself was trying to bury its secrets. Why would a man like Jack Callahan, a rancher scarred by war and loss, stake his hard-won solitude on a stranger no one else dared to see? That question hung heavy as the noon sun, and it's where this tale takes root. Jack rode into Redstone on his bay mare, Dusty, the creak of his saddle mingling with the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. At 40, he was a man carved from oak and iron, broad shoulders, a Stetson tipped low to hide the ghosts in his gray eyes, a former Union soldier. He'd survived the war only to lose his wife, Clara, and their boy, Ethan, to a Comanche raid. 10 years back, the memory clung to him like the scent of gun smoke, sharpening his edges, dulling his heart. He came to town for flour, salt, maybe a bottle of whiskey to drown the dreams that woke him sweating in the dead of night. Nothing more. He tied Dusty outside the saloon, his spurs jingling faintly, his gaze scanning the street out of habit, like a man who'd learned the world could turn on him in a heartbeat. Across the street, near the warped boards of the general store, a crowd parted without a glance. There, crumpled in the dust like a discarded rag, was an old woman. Her name, he'd learn, was Mary. Her gray hair straggled from a frayed bonnet, her dress so thin it barely held together, and her hands gnarled as mesquite roots clutched an empty tin cup. Her eyes, though, burned with a spark that hadn't quit even as hunger hollowed her cheeks. Townsfolk stepped over her, their boots kicking up clouds that settled on her like a shroud. A shopkeeper spat into the dirt, muttering, "Drifter trash." A young mother pulled her son away, whispering warnings about thieves and liars. Redstone had no patience for the broken. Jack stopped, one hand on the saloon door, the other tightening into a fist. He told himself to keep walking. He'd seen enough of the West's cruelty to know kindness could cost a man everything: his land, his name, his life. But something in Mary's trembling fingers, or the way she stared at the ground, like she'd lost all claim to hope, hooked into him. It wasn't just her frailty. It was the shadow of his own mother, long dead, who'd once looked at him with that same quiet defiance. He cursed under his breath, the sound swallowed by the wind, and crossed the street, his boots thudding against the boards, kneeling beside her. He tipped his hat back, letting her see his face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, rough as the gravel beneath them. "You need water?" Mary's head lifted, her eyes locking onto his with a mix of suspicion and surprise. "Ain't nobody cared in years," she rasped, her voice sharp, despite its weakness, like a knife dulled but still dangerous. Jack unhooked his canteen, holding it to her lips as she drank, her hands too shaky to manage alone. Water spilled down her chin, cutting tracks through the dust on her face. She coughed, then managed a faint. "Bless you, stranger." Her name, she said, was Mary. No last name, no past. Just a name that hung in the air like a half-forgotten song. The townsfolk noticed now, their murmurs rising like a swarm of locusts. "Callahan's lost his edge," a grizzled trader sneered, leaning against a post. "Taking in Strace'll get him killed," a saloon girl hissed, her voice carrying over the clink of glasses. Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He'd heard worse in his time, and he'd learned to let words slide off like rain on leather. Still, their stares bored into him, heavy as the heat. He lifted Mary to her feet, her weight so slight it startled him, and helped her onto Dusty's saddle. She gripped the horn, her knuckles white, her eyes darting like she expected a trap. "I got a ranch a few miles out," Jack said, swinging up behind her. "You'll eat tonight." Mary didn't reply, just nodded, her thin shoulders stiff, with something between fear and gratitude. As they rode out of Redstone, the town's whispers trailed them, sharp as thorns. "Fool," someone called. "She'll rob him blind." Another laughed. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, where the plains stretched endless and unforgiving. He didn't know why he'd done it, not yet. Maybe it was the war. Jack Callahan's bay mare, Dusty, slowed to a walk as they reached the ranch, the Texas plains rolling out like a faded quilt under a sky heavy with dusk. Mary, frail as a dried leaf, gripped the saddle horn, her silence louder than the wind. That tugged at her tattered bonnet. "We're home," Jack said, his voice low, steady as a river rock, though the word home felt strange on his tongue. He helped her down, her boots scraping the red dirt, and she stood, trembling, her eyes tracing the sprawl of his world, a cabin with a sagging tin roof, a barn weathered by years of sun and storm, a corral where cattle shifted, their lowing soft as a lullaby. To Mary, who'd known only Redstone's cruel streets, it was a sanctuary carved from the wilderness. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and solitude. Jack set a plate before her: cornbread, beans, a slice of salt pork, steam curling in the firelight. Mary ate with a hunger that cut Jack to the bone, her gnarled hands shaking, but her eyes fierce, as if the food might vanish like a mirage. He leaned against the doorframe, his own supper untouched, his gray eyes fixed on her. Why had he brought her here? The question gnawed at him, sharp as a spur. Maybe it was the war Shiloh's blood-soaked fields, the screams of men he couldn't save, or maybe it was Clara, his wife, whose laughter once warmed this room, or Ethan, their boy, whose small hand fit so perfectly in his before a Comanche raid stole them both 10 years ago. Mary's stubborn spark, the way she'd stared at Redstone's dust like it owed her something, had hooked him. It reminded him of his mother, long gone to fever, who'd faced the world with that same unyielding fire. Over the next 10 days, Mary wove herself into the ranch's rhythm. She scrubbed pots until they gleamed like polished silver, mended fences with a deftness that made Jack raise a brow, and cooked stews thick with sage, onion, and memories of better times. The scent filled the cabin, curling around Jack like a half-forgotten dream. Her sharp tongue kept him grounded. "Don't you track mud in my kitchen, Callahan," she'd snap, waving a wooden spoon like a marshal's badge, and Jack would chuckle a low, rusty sound he hadn't heard since Ethan chased chickens across the yard, his laughter bright as sunlight. Those evenings, by the hearth's glow, Mary let slip fragments of her past. "Husband died in '75, she said one night, her voice barely above the fire's crackle. "Fever took him, my boy. He turned on me after, stole our savings, our land, left me to beg in towns that don't care." Her words landed heavy, and Jack's chest tightened. He saw Clara's face in the flames, heard Ethan's voice calling, Pa, before the night that broke him. He didn't press Mary, but their shared silences built a bridge, fragile but real, over the chasm of their losses. Trouble, though, stalked the plains like a coyote. Amos Kane, a rival rancher with a smile sharp as a rattler's fang and a heart cold as winter iron, coveted Jack's land for its creek, a lifeline in this parched country. In Redstone, Amos worked the saloon like a preacher, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Callahan's harboring a thief," he told the crowd, his eyes glinting. "That old woman's got a price on her head, mark my words. She'll bleed him dry." The rumors slithered to Jack when he rode to town for nails and wire. The blacksmith, wiping sweat from his brow, warned, "Folks say she's trouble, Jack. Amos swears she's got a past black as coal." Jack's face hardened, but the words burrowed deep, like thorns under a saddle. He wanted to trust Mary, wanted to believe the woman who'd brought warmth to his empty days, but doubt crept in, slow and poison sweet. One evening, as Mary swept the porch, her broom stirring dust like ghosts of forgotten days, Jack noticed her satchel by the door, its flap open. Inside gleamed a silver locket, its surface etched with the name Elizabeth, not Mary. His gut twisted, sharp and cold. He waited until she settled by the fire, her hands busy mending a torn shirt, the needle flashing in the light. "This yours, Mary?" he asked, holding up the locket, his voice calm but his eyes boring into hers like a drill. She froze, her needle stilled, her face paling to the hue of ash. "It's a keepsake," she stammered, her voice cracking like dry timber. "From someone I lost long ago. My daughter." Her eyes darted to the shadows, and Jack's heart sank. He wanted to believe her, wanted to hold onto the fragile trust they'd built. But the locket felt like a lie, heavy as lead in his palm, and her trembling words only deepened the shadows between them. Before he could speak, a shout tore through the night, raw and mean. Jack grabbed his Winchester from the wall. stepping onto the porch as hoofbeats thundered closer, shaking the earth. 5 of Amos's men reined up at the corral, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats, their laughter sharp as a coyote's. "How, fences looking weak," Callahan, one jeered, his knife flashing as he slashed a rope. Another tossed a torch onto a haystack, flames licking the darkness like a hungry beast. The cattle surged, their bellows rising in panic, and Jack raised his rifle, his blood pounding. But the men spurred their horses, vanishing into the night, their jeers trailing like smoke. Mary stood in the doorway, her hands clutching her shawl, her eyes wide with a fear that cut deeper than Jack expected. "They're comin' for us, ain't they?" she whispered, her voice trembling but edged with steel, like a blade drawn from its sheath. Jack didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the burning hay, the flames casting long shadows across the ranch. The locket, the rumors, the cut fences, they were storm clouds piling high, dark and heavy with menace. He didn't know Mary's truth, didn't know if she was the thief Amos claimed, but he'd brought her here, given her a place to stand, and no man, not Amos Kane, not his hired guns, would tear that away, not without a fight that'd echo across the plains. The dying flames of the torched haystack cast a flickering glow across Jack Callahan's ranch, painting the night in shades of fire and shadow. Mary's voice, raw and trembling, still echoed in his ears. "They're comin' for us, ain't they?" And Jack's silence, heavy as the Winchester in his hands, was all the answer he could muster. The slashed fences, the panicked lowing of his cattle, the mocking laughter of Amos Kane's men riding off into the dark. It was a gauntlet thrown down, sharp and cold as a blade. Jack turned to Mary, her frail frame unbowed in the doorway, her eyes glinting with a fear she fought to bury. "Get inside," he said, his voice low, steady as a heartbeat in a storm. "We'll fix this come dawn." But as he stamped out the embers, the weight of the silver locket in his pocket touched with Elizabeth, and the doubt it stirred burned hotter than the fire itself. Dawn broke red over the Texas plains, the sky bleeding like a warning. Jack saddled Dusty, his hands moving with the muscle memory of a soldier, though his mind churned with questions. Mary joined him, her steps slow but deliberate, a hammer and wire in her hands to mend the corral. They worked in silence, the clink of metal and the creak of wood blending with the distant call of a hawk. Jack watched, her torn between the warmth she'd brought to his empty days and the shadow of Amos's rumors. Was she a thief, as the saloon whispers claimed, or just another soul ground down by the West's merciless teeth? Her strength tying knots with hands that shouldn't have. Such skill made him want to trust her. But trust was a gamble, and Jack had lost too much to bet lightly. The locket, its name not hers, was a splinter in his thoughts, sharp and unrelenting. By noon, the heat pressed down like a branding iron, and the cattle grew restless, their heads tossing as if they smelled trouble on the wind. Jack and Mary rode back to the ranch, dust clinging to their clothes, sweat streaking their faces. Hoofbeats thundered from the west, sudden and heavy, and Jack's hand flew to his revolver, his soldier's instincts flaring like a struck match. 8 of Amos's men crested the ridge, their silhouettes black against a sunset that burned, crimson, rifles glinting like the eyes of a wolf pack. Callahan, their leader, Holt, bellowed, his scar-twisted face sneering under a battered hat. "Hand over the old woman, or we'll burn this ranch to cinders." Jack's heart hammered, but his voice was cold as a winter creek. "You're on my land, Holt. Ride off, or you'll be carried off in pine." The air snapped tight, then shattered. Holt's men charged, guns blazing, bullets ripping through the corral fence like hail through canvas. Jack dove behind a water trough, his revolver cracking in reply, each shot steady from years of war. Shiloh, Antietam, battles that still woke him screaming. A bullet grazed his arm, blood soaking his sleeve, hot and sticky, but he bit down the pain, firing back, dropping one rider with a shot to the shoulder. The cattle stampeded, their hooves a deafening roar, kicking up dust that choked the air, like a sandstorm. Jack thought Mary would run, any sane person would, but she scrambled to the barn, her movements quick as a jackrabbit. He cursed, thinking she'd flee, but she emerged with his old Henry rifle, her hands steady as stone. She fired a shot into the sky, the crack splitting the chaos, and Holt's men faltered, their horses rearing in confusion. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice raw but fierce. A lioness roaring from a frail frame. Jack stared, stunned, as Mary knelt beside him, her eyes wide but unyielding. "I ain't worth this, Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking over the gunfire. "Let me go. Save your land." He shook his head, his gaze locked on hers, seeing not a thief but a woman who'd fought to survive a world that didn't care. "You're stayin'," he growled, reloading his revolver with blood-slick fingers. Then her next words hit like a slug to the chest. "That locket," she said, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "It was my daughter's, Elizabeth. My boy, my Caleb, he stole it, sold her land to Amos Kane. He rides with them now." The truth landed like a thunderclap. Caleb, Amos's right-hand man, the one who'd sneered at Jack in Redstone's saloon, was Mary's son, the one who'd left her to starve. Jack's mind reeled, memories of his own losses, Clara's gentle touch, Ethan's laughter colliding with Mary's pain. There was no time to unravel it. Holt's men regrouped, their shouts closing in like a noose. Hooves pounded again, but not from Amos's men. The town sheriff, Dawkins, rode up under a tattered white flag, his weary frame slouched in the saddle, his badge glinting like a lie. "Callahan, you're outmanned," he said, spitting tobacco into the dirt, his smirk as false as a snake oil. "Peddler's promise. Amos says the woman's a thief, wanted in 3 counties for stealing land deeds. Hand her over, or I'll let him take this ranch by force." Jack stood, his revolver still in hand, blood dripping from his arm to the dust. "Amos don't own me," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "And neither do you." Mary stays. Dawkins's eyes narrowed to slits, but he reined his horse back, muttering, "You'll regret this come morning." He rode off, leaving a chill in the air. The dust settled, revealing splintered fences, scattered cattle, and the acrid sting of gunpowder. Mary clutched the rifle, her hands shaking now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He was all I had after Elizabeth died. He chose Amos over me." Jack's heart twisted, seeing his own grief mirrored his family gone, his trust battered by years of betrayal. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice rough but sure. "You got me now, Mary. Ain't nobody taken that away." Her eyes met his, gratitude and guilt warring within them, and for a moment, the world was just the two of them, standing amidst the wreckage of a fight they hadn't chosen. The ambush was a warning, but the war was coming. Amos Kane, Caleb, the sheriff, they'd be back, hungrier, meaner. The locket, Mary's truth, the blood on Jack's sleeve, they were all pieces of a fight he couldn't walk away from. He'd chosen Mary, chosen loyalty over doubt, and now he'd face the consequences. Come hell or high water, on a land that demanded everything and forgave nothing. The dust from the ambush still clung to the air, heavy with the acrid bite of gunpowder and the iron tang of Jack Callahan's blood. Mary's confession about Caleb, her son, now Amos Kane's right-hand man, hung between them like a raw wound, her tear-streaked face etched in the fading light of the torched haystack. "You got me now, Mary," Jack had said, his hand steady on her shoulder, his voice rough but solid as oak. She'd turned away, clutching the old Henry rifle, her eyes a storm of gratitude and guilt, her frail frame unbowed despite the weight of her past. The splintered corral, the scattered cattle, the blood crusting on Jack's arm, they were battle scars of a war that was far from over. Amos Kane's men would return, hungrier, meaner, and Jack knew the next fight would demand every piece of his battered soul. Dawn broke over the Texas plains, painting the sky in hues of gold and ash, but a chill lingered, sharp as a blade's edge. Jack and Mary worked side by side, fortifying the ranch like soldiers bracing for a siege. They dragged cedar logs to shore up the corral, nailed rough-hewn boards across the cabin's windows, and stacked hay bales into makeshift barricades, their movements swift but heavy with unspoken dread. Jack's arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, each pulse a reminder of the cost of standing his ground. Mary, her hands steady despite her age, hauled buckets of water from the creek to douse any fires Amos might set, her steps slow but deliberate, her face set with a defiance that made Jack's chest ache. She glanced at the horizon, as if Caleb's shadow might emerge, and Jack saw the pain of a mother betrayed, still clinging to a flicker of hope for a son who'd chosen greed over blood. Inside the cabin, they took stock ammunition, provisions. Resolve, Jack sharpened his knife. The blade's rasp quiet him against the morning's stillness. Mary patched a torn blanket, her needle flashing in the dim light, her silence louder than words. "You ever miss him so much it hurts to breathe?" she asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the creak of the floorboards. Jack's hands stilled, his revolver half cleaned. Memories of Clara flooding back her gentle smile as she hummed over the stove. The way her hand fit in his. Ethan's laughter, bright as a summer dawn, chasing chickens across the yard, echoed in his ears. "Every day," he said, his voice rough as gravel, his gray eyes distant. "Lost my wife, Clara, and our boy, Ethan, to a Comanche raid in '77. 10 years, and it's still like a knife twistin' in me." Mary's gaze met his, wet and shining. Her own pain laid bare. "Elizabeth, my daughter, died giving birth to Caleb's sister, who didn't make it neither," she said, her voice cracking like dry wood. "Caleb was my last piece of her. When he turned on me, sold her land to Amos, it was like losing her all over again." Jack's throat tightened, the shared weight of their losses binding them closer than blood. He saw Clara and Mary's stubborn strength, Ethan and her quiet hope. "You're the son I should have had." "Jack," Mary said, her voice barely a whisper, but it landed like a thunderclap in his chest. The words stirred something deep, a need for family he'd buried under years of solitude. He wanted to tell her she'd given him something to a reason to fight, a spark in the darkness of his days, but his tongue felt heavy, unpracticed in such truths. Instead, he reached out, his calloused hand covering hers, rough but warm. They sat in silence, the fire's embers casting shadows that danced like ghosts, their bond of fragile promise against the storm gathering outside. The next morning, hoofbeats broke the quiet, sharp and solitary. Jack stepped onto the porch, his revolver holstered, his Winchester propped against the wall, his eyes scanning the horizon. A lone rider approached Caleb, Mary's son, his black hat low, his face hard as flint, his eyes cold as a snake's under the brim. Mary froze in the doorway, her breath catching, the silver locket now hanging around her neck glinting like a beacon in the sun. "Ma," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of warmth, "give me that locket. It's proof of the land Amos bought fair and square. You got no claim." Mary's hand went to the locket, her fingers trembling, but her voice was steady, cutting through the morning's heat. "You sold your sister's land, Caleb. You sold me out for Amos's coin. This locket's all I got left of Elizabeth, and you ain't taking it." Caleb's face twitched, a flicker of shame buried under greed, but his hand rested on his gun. "Amos owns this valley," he said. "Hand it over, or he'll burn this ranch to the ground, and you with it." Jack's blood surged, his hand hovering over his revolver, but Mary's next move stopped him cold. She unclasped the locket, her fingers shaking, tears welling as she held it out to Caleb. "Take it," she said, her voice breaking like glass. "Leave Jack's land alone. I ain't worth his ruin." Her sacrifice hit Jack like a sledgehammer, a selfless act born of love and guilt, and he saw Clara and her Clara, who'd once stood between him and danger, her heart fierce to the end. "No," Jack said, stepping between them, his voice low, dangerous as a storm's rumble. "You're home now, Mary. He don't get to take that." Caleb's hand twitched toward his gun, but Jack's stare held him, a soldier's resolve forged in blood and loss, unyielding as the plains themselves. "Ride out, Caleb," Jack said, each word sharp as a bullet. "Next time, I won't ask." Caleb's eyes flicked to Mary, then back to Jack, a moment of hesitation before he spurred his horse, vanishing into the dust, his threat lingering. Like a noose, that night, Jack and Mary sat on the porch, the stars sharp as knives above the endless plains. Crickets sang, a fragile counterpoint to the tension coiling in their bones. "Why'd you do it?" Mary asked, her voice soft, raw, her eyes searching his. "Risk everything for me." A stranger, Jack looked to the horizon, where Amos's men would come at dawn. "Their rifles hungry, 'cause you ain't a stranger. No more," he said, the words simple but heavy, like a vow carved in stone. "Your family, Mary. and I've lost enough of that for one lifetime." Her hand found his, her grip frail but fierce, and for the first time in years, Jack felt the weight of it. The first light of dawn broke over Jack Callahan's ranch, sharp and cold. As the rumble of hooves grew louder, a dark line of riders cresting the ridge like a storm rolling in. "They're here," Mary whispered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, her hands gripping the old Henry rifle as she stood beside Jack on the porch. The locket hung heavy around her neck, glinting like a final stand against the past. Jack loaded his Winchester, his bloodied arm stiff, but his resolve unyielding, his gray eyes scanning the horizon where Amos Kane's gang approached, their rifles flashing with intent. The plains stretched silent, the air thick with the promise of blood, and Jack knew this was no mere raid. It was a reckoning for the ranch, for Mary, for the family they'd forged in the ashes of their losses. Amos's men, 12 strong, fanned out across the ridge, their horses snorting clouds of dust, their leader's voice cutting through the morning. "Callahan," Amos bellowed, his rattler's smile glinting under his black hat. "Give us the woman and that locket, or we'll burn this place to hell." Beside him, Caleb sat tall in the saddle, his face a mask of greed, but his eyes flickered when they met Mary's, a shadow of the boy she'd raised. Jack stepped forward, his Winchester raised, his voice cold as a winter wind. "This is my land, Amos. You want it, you'll pay in blood." Mary's hand brushed his arm, a silent plea, but Jack's stare held firm, a soldier's defiance forged in battles long past. The air shattered with gunfire. Amos's men charged, bullets tearing through the hay bales Jack and Mary had stacked as cover. Jack fired back, his shots precise, dropping one rider with a crack that echoed across the plains. The cattle stampeded, their hooves a thunderous roar, and dust rose like a fog, choking the light. Jack ducked behind a barricade, his arm screaming with pain, but his focus was sharp. Every shot a memory of Shiloh, of Clara and Ethan, of a life he'd fight to honor. Mary, crouched beside him, fired the Henry, her aim wild but fierce, her face set with a mother's wrath. A bullet grazed her shoulder, blood blooming on her dress, but she didn't flinch, reloading with hands that shook only from effort, not fear. In the chaos, Caleb broke from the pack, his horse charging toward the cabin. Jack raised his rifle, but Mary's cry stopped him. "Caleb," she shouted, stepping into the open, her voice raw, piercing the gunfire. "You're my son. You don't have to do this." Caleb reined up, his gun drawn, his face twisting with shame and rage. "You're weak, Ma." He spat, but his hand trembled, the locket's glint catching his eye. Jack saw the moment Mary's plea, Caleb's hesitation, and acted. He lunged, tackling Caleb from his horse, the two men hitting the dirt in a tangle of fists and dust. Caleb's gun fired, the shot wild, and Jack pinned him, his revolver pressed to Caleb's chest. "Drop it," Jack growled, but his eyes flicked to Mary, her face a mask of anguish. "Don't kill him," she whispered, tears falling. Jack's jaw tightened, but he eased back, knocking Caleb's gun away with a swift blow, sparing his life for her sake. The tide turned as a new sound broke through hooves, not from Amos's men, but from Redstone. Sheriff Dawkins, his badge glinting, rode in with a posse, their rifles raised. "Enough," Dawkins shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Amos, you're done." Jack stood, wary, his gun still on Caleb. Dawkins's eyes met his, and for once, they held no greed. "Folks in town heard about your stand, Callahan," he said. "They're tired of Kane's tyranny." The posse rounded up Amos's men, their fight draining as cuffs snapped on wrists. Amos, cornered, snarled, but his empire crumbled under the weight of justice. Caleb, disarmed, knelt in the dust, his head bowed, Mary's locket gleaming at his feet. As the posse led Amos away, Mary knelt beside Caleb, her hand reaching for his, but he pulled back, his eyes empty. "I ain't your son no more," he said, his voice hollow, and rode off with the sheriff, leaving Mary trembling. Jack helped her to her feet, her shoulder bloodied but her spirit unbroken. Months later, under a quiet spring sky, Jack carved Mary Callahan on a headstone. By the creek, her frail body finally at rest after a winter fever took her, he hung the locket on the marker, its silver catching the sun, a symbol of the family they'd built. "You gave me a home," he whispered, his voice cracking, "and I'll carry you always in the West. Family ain't just blood, it's the ones you fight for, the ones who fight for you." The story echoes the fence-cutting wars of 1885, when Texas ranchers battled land barons like Amos, and sheriffs, pushed by honest folk, upheld new laws to protect the small man's claim. Jack's stand was one of many, a spark of justice in a hard land. If this tale of loyalty and redemption hit you, smash that like